Hey fellow golfers, in the vein of the top 10 series pro comparisons, I'm going to do this dedicated one on a superb Spanish golfer, Jon Rahm, who by the time you get this clip, he'll have completed Augusta and hopefully done extremely well. He's certainly up there with the leaders after 36 holes. I will be putting a number of images up above, and you will take a look at those to see his overall swing. Like the other pro comparisons, I will cover some of the key elements of starting from his address to his finish, but then I will look at 5 key things you can learn and copy from him with some additional diagrams to illustrate that. So let's look at his address. At address, he's very balanced, and you can see that he has very powerful legs. Because of that balance, he's very ready, but he's in a good, powerful position. In the start of his takeaway, you'll see that he starts with his arms, a little bit like an earlier clip you would have seen of Adam Scott. Although he's beginning to coil his body, his arms start to disconnect from his body, but at the same time you will see that his club is parallel with his hands when he's square in the initial part of the takeaway. Very important initial move. You will have seen from other clips I've done that people like Justin Thomas and Sanjay Im also have that initial slow takeaway with their arms. They check that before they come back to address, and then they do a more fluid full stroke. At the top, you will notice 3 things about Jon Rahm. Firstly, he has a much shorter backswing than most players and most pros, but actually he's in a very powerful position. He begins his transition before he reaches the top of his backswing. It's key to his power and speed. So he changes direction much earlier. And also his wrist is in a bowed position. You've seen in some of the clips I've done about turning your wrist over, either your back wrist down, your forward wrist over, whichever you prefer to think about it, or that bowed position of the lead wrist. Dustin Johnson does this as well. So he has that bowed lead wrist. In his case, it's the left wrist because he's a right-hander. So those are the 3 things to take away from Jon Rahm's top of the backswing. On transition, because as I mentioned, he starts his transition early, you'll see a big hip move, almost as he's even doing his backswing. He starts his hip move and hip turn early, and then that allows him to slot his hands and his club into the really good shallow position. So that's key. That's affected by the top of the backswing that I just mentioned. Because of his bowed wrist, it's easy to then come down shallow. So it's a really key part of how he begins his power move. At the impact point, a couple of important things to point out. He has a very good side bend, and that's important. Many amateurs in particular, they tend to get upright too quickly. He keeps that side bend in covering the ball, and yet he has a very good body rotation. But because of his shallow path that I just referred to, his trail arm is very stable. He doesn't need it to be swinging through too much. And in part because he's got a slightly closed position at the top, by a greater body movement and turn, he actually, and a slower right arm coming through, in fact that helps him to square up the face with the target line and not pull the ball around because of his body rotation. So that bowed wrist and shallow path gives him that very good impact with that big body turn. On the finish, like all great golfers, he has a very balanced finish. His arms flow nicely through with his body. And also you will note at the top of his finish, he doesn't bend his arms too much. He has a much straighter set of arms. I believe it's about 80 degrees. Other people, many amateurs, they bend their arms too much as they come through. So he tends to keep his arms straighter as he comes through. And that's part of that power move. And I'll come back to some of these points in the key takeaways shortly. First key takeaway, he has a short backswing, and that's key to his speed. Part of that is his quickness to turn and move his weight onto his front foot before he reaches the transition point, and his flatness of his lead wrist at the top, which gets him into the right position for that power move. So a short backswing allows him to have early acceleration. As part of the same issue, he recenters his body, his hips, very quickly and very early, much earlier than most. Recentering your balance and your hips to cover the ball is one of the keys to striking the ball well and powerfully. In part, what that says is don't move your hips too far early. Move your hips very slightly. You rotate, but don't move your hips too much. Get set in that forward weight position before you reach the top of the transition point, so you've given yourself that little extra time to get into that shallow swing and that speed that you need to come through. Third, flex your wrist at the top. I've covered this quite a lot already, but it's a really important piece to think about, certainly as you come down, because you want that shallow follow through. It helps him, as I mentioned, it helps him square the club face very easily, even though he has a big turn through. And it is certainly something that I have found has helped me a lot, is to actually think, in my case I'm a left-hander, so I think of holding a plate of food as I get to that top, and then come down as if I'm throwing a frisbee. Fourth, very important, if you look at his and examine his swing carefully, he works to achieve width, not depth. So you'll see a lot of amateurs pull the club in a lot, and they're not getting any width, so they're losing actually speed and power. Although the swing is a circular motion, you want to achieve width, not depth. So don't let your lead arm come too close to your chest. If you do that, you're pulling your club inwards too much. You want to be achieving width, so a little bit of space between your chest and your lead arm as you do the circular motion. But you think of that width and think of that turn, that shallow turn, as you come back down. And then finally, as mentioned earlier, his right arm is not bent too much as he comes through. It's much straighter. So try to keep that back arm straighter. So again, that's part of the width issue on the follow through that you match in your backswing. If you keep those 5 key things in mind, it might significantly help your speed, your distance, and your accuracy, a la John Rahm. I will do a clip soon on key golf moves and comparisons of pros compared to amateurs. That's some work that has been done by others, like Athletic Motion Golf, using gears, show about what are the slight differences in the start up, address, take away, transition, hip moves, wrist positions between pros and amateurs. Very useful thing to think about. These 5 things of John Rahm actually very much speak to some of those elements. See you on the flip side. Do subscribe, do put the notifications on, give me a like. Happy golfing.